Welcome back to another episode of Done is Better Than Perfect. This show is for all you recovering perfectionists out there that understand that the pressure and the stress that comes with attaining perfection is so often accompanied by guilt and shame when we don't reach it. I've got a special show for you today. We're going to talk about accountability. And I'll tell you up front that we're going to answer three questions that really permeate the true meaning of accountability, because accountability is something that is very difficult for many companies to both define and attain. And as we go through these questions, I want you to think about your own organization. Think about the team that you function on, or even the team that you lead. How well are you doing at holding people accountable for both the good and the not so good on your team? How well do you convince people that it is perfectly okay to be held accountable and not feel like you're blamed? So I'm going to answer these questions that I think will give you some clarity around what the word means, and then most importantly, how to have an impact on your organization as a leader. So the first question that we're going to answer today is, what is accountability? How do you define it? And I will tell you that contemporary society has misdefined the word accountability. You see people on TV talking about who are we going to hold accountable? Who are we going to hold responsible? Those words have been somehow jammed together as synonymous, and they're not synonymous. Think about the word accountability. The root word of accountability is count, the ability to count. Now, the root word in responsibility is response or respond, the ability to respond to a situation. The two words have origins that have not come from the same place. And when you use them interchangeably, like you hear on the press sometimes, who are you going to hold accountable, who are you going to hold responsible, they're in fact both code words for blame. So as we think about this definition of accountability, I want you to think about how we're going to hold people responsible going forward. In other words, is there a way for them to respond to a situation? Now, the two words are closely related, but not synonymous. And I think you'll understand as we go through the rest of this. So accountability is defined as the ability to count. It is quantitative. It has to have some measurement. It could be something like a batting average. It could be a production goal. It could be anything that you measure to see how well someone's performed. Another root component of accountability is a bank account. How much is in a bank account? Accountability has neither good nor bad connotations. It is what it is. And when you look at it through that filter, I hope it gives you a little bit of a distinction that most people don't have. When we blur those words together, it's when it becomes confusing. So the first question we answered is, what is accountability? Accountability is the ability to count performance, the ability to form an account of what happened, be it the number of accidents, be it some sort of quantitative measure that reflects some numerical value. So we've defined it. Now, how do we create an accountable culture? First thing, if we're going to hold someone accountable for something, we have to include them in decisions and assignments. We have to give them input. And notice I use the word include. There are some people that hear me say this, especially in a big public setting, and they'll say, well, does that mean they get to make the decisions? And I said, no. Listen real carefully. People have to be included in decisions and assignments. Now, what do you think is the main reason you want to include someone in a decision or in an assignment? They get buy-in. It's part of theirs. Great leaders are about getting people to adopt an idea or opinion as if it were their own. When we exclude people from the decision making, when we exclude people from assignments, it becomes your assignment, not my assignment. Now, sometimes the leader has to take both input from the subordinates and their own reasoning and come up with the decision that they make. But as long as the subordinate had some sort of inclusion in the decision, they're likely to support it because they had part of it. Now, the second thing that's important in order to have an accountable culture is people have to be delegated the responsibility for something. So this is where those two things become close enough where people can confuse them. In other words, when I delegate the responsibility of something to someone, I am letting them respond. Remember, responsibility is the ability to respond in a situation. Think about this. When you had your first child, you had the responsibility for that child. If they were dirty, you changed them. If they were cold, you clothed them. If they were hungry, you fed them. You were able to respond to their needs. So this is I think the piece that some leaders struggle with is letting go of the bicycle seat so that the subordinate can be able to respond to the situation. I see this often in organizations that don't want to let supervisors pick their own teams. If I pick your team for you and you have 5 people on the team and they're all duds, who's accountable for the performance of the team? I am. But if I let you pick your team and you pick 5 people who are ineffective and you do nothing about it, you're accountable. So think about accountability as letting go of the bicycle seat, letting people respond to the situations as they would, and then look at the numeric output that comes up. How well did they perform? If it's binary, was it good or bad? If it's quantitative, can you measure their performance? And then the third thing that people need in order to have a true accountable culture is people need the resources to be successful. That could be people, it could be equipment, it could be time, it could be education, it could be training. A whole lot of things go into the word resources. We have coined the word human resources. But if people aren't given what they need to be successful and they work for us, there's no way that we can hold them accountable. You know, I think back to organizations who want to do well with their teams, but they're so myopic that they don't provide training up front. They don't provide, things like technology for people to be successful, and then they wonder why people fail. So remember, there's 3 things that you need in order to have an accountable culture. 1, they need to be included in decisions and assignments. Doesn't mean they make them, it only means that they're included. 2, they're delegated the responsibility for something. In other words, we're going to let them be responsible for the outcomes. And folks, sometimes that's hard because people fail, and that has to be okay as well. We learn from those failures. Failures are like tuition. You've paid the tuition, why not learn from the experience? And then the third thing is people need the resources to be successful. If we don't give them the resources, there's no way to hold them accountable. So that's question number 2. Now, I hope that you are comfortable dropping in comments, whether you agree or disagree with what I'm saying. I hope that you feel like if this is something that's valuable for you, that you can check the like button, or even better, if this is the first time to hear our show, I hope you're able to subscribe to the show and share this information with people that you think would find value. Now, our third question that we're going to answer is what factors need to be in place in order for people to be held accountable. I call these accountability performance factors. And the first thing is, now think about this, if someone is going to be held accountable, the factor that is most important is we have to give them authority. In other words, they don't have to act in the absence of higher authority. It is theirs. They have control. Like a coach, especially in the NFL, having full control of the team. And we know there are examples right now that don't coincide with that thinking. We know that there are coaches and owners who have relationships that are not built with pure accountability. Now, the second thing that I think is important in order to hold someone accountable, the second factor is team measurements. Remember, the root word of accountability is count. And if you don't have a way to regularly count key factors like input, throughput, or output so that we can monitor how well people are doing, then it's really hard to hold someone accountable. One of the biggest struggles that I see, especially in manufacturing organizations, is that it's very hard for the person that's actually doing the work to know the score, to know how they're doing. And some of the most, I guess, successful organizations are putting up scoreboards so that people can know throughout the day, throughout the shift, throughout the hour, what their team measurement is. Are we ahead or behind? Imagine playing basketball for 3 hours and nobody keeps score. It's just a game. It's just practice. It's not competitive unless we know the score. And I do think that some level of competition is good for all of us. It can get unhealthy, but to some degree we're all competitive. I'm probably overly competitive and have to work against that, but I think the opposite end of that spectrum that doesn't tap into our human competitiveness is a missed opportunity. The next factor that's needed for someone to be held accountable is priority setting. No time is wasted wondering which task is more important. Priorities are consistently clear. I believe a leader should clarify priorities multiple times each day. That they should go back for their employees and say, hey, priorities have changed. We're now doing X, Y, and Z instead of A, B, and C. And that has to happen constantly throughout a shift, throughout a month, whatever the measuring period is. It has to be constant. In order for people to be held accountable, they have to be given clear deadlines and completion dates. When a decision is made, someone clarifies who will do what and by when. And think about this. It is never insubordinate for someone to ask a boss, when do you need this? It doesn't matter if it's the CEO of the company. If they ask you for something, your default should be, when do you need it? And the thing that we often confuse in the world of accountability is we equate the rank of the requester with the importance or the urgency of the request. In other words, if the CEO asks you for something, we're supposed to drop everything and do what the CEO says. Well, that's incorrect. What we should do is say, hey, when do you need it? And she might say, well, the end of the week is fine, or the end of the month is fine. So always ask for by whens. And the funny thing about by whens is you can condition people in your organization to start giving them to you automatically. If this is not in your culture, start asking, when do you need this? And people will slowly, intuitively start giving you those by whens without even thinking about it. Now, in order for someone to be held accountable, it's also important that we have follow-through. Follow-through means that commitments are tracked. Today, it's through technology. There's really no excuse. I remember when I first started my career, I had a boss that he was so good at telling me, he said, the one thing that I want you to be successful at, the one thing I want you to be measured by is by the amount of people that come and ask you for your help. And he said the way you do that is by following up on their requests. And I remember my first attempt at follow-through was a small spiral notebook. And when people asked me for something as a leader, I would write it down in that book so that I could make sure I never forgot it, because he was watching. And as I would complete them, I would scratch them off. Well, today we have technology. We have computers. We have, my little notebook evolved, and don't laugh at me, into a Palm Pilot. And I carried a Palm Pilot and a phone. But my Palm Pilot became the residual location of all my follow-through or commitments. And that gave way to the BlackBerry. And I was one of those people that didn't go willing or didn't go gentle into that good night when it came from switching from the BlackBerry to the iPhone. I didn't want to lose the touch of those little buttons, the feel of those buttons under my thumbs, to a screen that was flat. But eventually I did. And having an iPhone now with all of the technology that's in your iPhone leaves us really no excuse when it comes to follow through and honoring our commitments. And by the way, people are always keeping score. In other words, every time you follow through with something and you take care of something for someone, they put a marble in your jar. They trust that you're going to follow up with them. Or they keep a little mental note that this guy does what he says. This person's a person of integrity because they do what they say. So make sure that we're always following through with commitments. If people ask us for something, make sure that we have enough respect for them to be able to go back and ask them, hey, this is what I've got for you. Or if you're unable to fulfill their request, you're able to go back and say, hey, This is not going to happen this year. It's a capital budget issue. We're not going to get to it. There's no way we can take care of it. I just wanted you to know where we stand. The next factor that makes people accountable is what I call single point accountability. There's one person accountable for each task, period. I grew up in a family with brothers and sisters, and if my mother said, hey, kids, one of you take the trash out, how likely do you think it is that someone would take the trash out? Of course, I was the oldest, and I was like, hey, she's not talking to me, she's talking to you, and on and on and on and on. She found out real quickly that she had to say, John, take out the trash. So there's one person accountable for each task. And I see organizations where they try to put a department or a function on the accountability line, and that doesn't work. If there's a function that is responsible, then the chief of that function's name goes on the line. If it's maintenance, the maintenance manager's name goes on the line. Now, it doesn't mean that they can't delegate that to someone else, but they're still the one that's accountable for performing the task, regardless of who they delegate it to. Now, another factor that's important for accountability is reinforcement. People need to be appreciated for work well done. People need to be told exactly what they did that was liked. And I'm going to tell you, we have somehow got to this point in business and in society where we're so obsessed with the negative. We're so obsessed with the exception. And when you really think about that dysfunction, you have people that have done 100, 1,000 things right. And then we as leaders are going to focus on the one negative thing or the two negative things that didn't work the way we wanted to. Folks, to me, that's bass backwards in Texas slang. It is so flawed as a way of thinking that we are going to just skip over all the good and go straight to the bad. People need to be reinforced. You know, I just shared a class on emotional intelligence. People need to be validated. People need to be verified. People need to have someone notice the work that they did. And I promise you, in an accountable culture, when you recognize people for doing things right, you get more of that behavior. Don't be that person who's always focused on the exception and takes the good for granted, takes success for granted. Look at the things that are done in your organization well and thrive on those. If there's something negative, you don't ignore it, you address it, but don't let negativity become the epicenter of your existence as a leader. And then the last factor that's needed in order for people to be held accountable is honest feedback when they fail. When a leader's unhappy with an employee's work, she's got to tell him as soon as possible in private. Now, when I say as soon as possible, I don't like the variation in that term, but what I mean by that is everybody doesn't absorb emotion the same way. So if you are one of those people that gets angry, it is not very effective for you to have that discussion with that subordinate while you're angry. Allow yourself some time to calm down. And why do you think it's important to have a conversation that's can be construed as negative privately? Well, I worked for a gentleman years ago who seemed to have a problem with one of my coworkers. We were all managers and we reported to this vice president. And this vice president was never bad to me, but we had a coworker that he would just seem to beat up on constantly. And even though I never was treated bad by this vice president, I lost all respect for him because I saw how he treated my coworker Steve. And I said to myself, you know, if he will do that to Steve, then at some point in time he's potentially going to do that for me. So I had no trust for this guy, not because he treated me badly, but because he treated my colleague badly. So the best practice is to always discipline in private. Now, there's one exception, is that if you think that there's a need to have a witness in the room, this could be an HR issue, but those are rare exceptions. Most of the time you want to have this conversation with someone in private so that they don't lose their dignity in front of their peers. And I always like to give people praise in public, discipline in private. And the last thing about this feedback is that it's got to be extremely specific. Don't generalize. You want to be as clear as you can about the unappreciated work or action, but never accusatory, judgmental, or vindictive. In other words, don't accuse them of something, stick to the facts. Remember, our mind always forms judgments behind the facts. And when we go to the judgment instead of sticking to the facts, that's when there's time for people to argue or push back against the feedback that you're giving them. And I tell people, when it's hard to argue with what really happened. You know, if 3 jars were broken in the last hour, that's a lot different from saying you're being careless. So make sure that if you're giving someone feedback, it's not accusatory, judgmental, or vindictive. So we've answered 3 questions about accountability in the workplace. And I want you to think about how you can apply these in your workplace, in your home, with your children, you know, in your voluntary work that you do. How can you understand that accountability is something I create as the leader? I build it into the culture. I perform these factors that promote accountability. And remember what I said in the beginning. Accountability is elusive for most organizations. The 3 things that companies tell me they want to improve upon are communication, accountability, and trust. So I hope this episode has given you just a little bit of an insight into how you can have an accountable culture. And if you've liked this episode, make sure you like the video below, make a comment, let me know your thoughts. I don't have feedback in this medium. I don't have a way of having you call in because these are pre-recorded. But I do want to know what you think. I do want to know if you agree with what I'm saying or disagree with what I'm saying. And remember, I always try to give something away every time I speak, be it on this medium, be it in front of a group, or be it on a stage. So, Marsha's ringing in right here. Hold on a second. I always try to give something away. Think about this. If you go to www.johngrubbs.com, I will give you a free copy of my first leadership book titled Leadership Among Idiots. You can download it as a PDF file or you can download it as a Mobi file, however you prefer to consume your books electronically. That is a free gift that I'm giving to you. Something that I can say thank you for taking the time to listen to me. Your time is precious. And I always end with this statement reminding you that done is better than perfect. Until next time.